Boy leaves school in tears daily. Mom storms to principal with recorder from his bag. Melinda hopped out of the bathroom with her towel on. Her long, wet hair accentuated her beauty even more than usual. She pulled out her uniform from her wardrobe and laid it on the bed. She then carefully applied her makeup and pampered herself up for the day. This was one of Melinda's favorite parts of the day. She loved looking and feeling good. She believed it gave her an edge over the day and boosted her confidence. After going through her full morning routine, she finally looked at herself in the mirror with much admiration. Her short waitressing uniform showed off one of her favorite features, her legs. "Josh, I hope you're ready. We leave in 10. Melinda yelled as she made cereal for her and her son. Josh entered the kitchen dragging his feet, still partially asleep with his backpack on. Josh was in the 3rd grade and was the apple of Melinda's eye, even though he often drove her up the wall. Melinda had raised him independently since his father's passing when he was just a toddler. Josh and Melinda had, for the most part, been the only family each had ever known. "Mom, I don't want to go to school today," Josh whined. "Yeah? Well, I don't want to go to work either. But somebody's got to pay the bills, and somebody else has got to make sure they're able to one day. So, eat up and get ready to leave, little man," Melinda said, kissing Josh's forehead. "No fair." Josh sulked. Melinda proceeded to drop off her son at school. They shared a quirky mother-son handshake of their own making before Josh jovially ran off into school. Melinda then headed to the diner where she worked. The customers at the dinner loved Melinda, especially the men. She would serve them with the warmest smile, and the short skirt on her uniform didn't hurt either. Later that day, when Melinda picked up Josh, she noticed a sudden change in his mood. Melinda tried to greet him with their handshake as usual, but he simply ignored her and jumped into the car. The ride home was uncharacteristically silent. Josh would usually tell her about his day, and then she would do the same. They would laugh about the day's adventures and get ice cream on the way home. But today, the trip was completely silent. "Everything okay, Josh?" Melinda asked. Melinda let it be, closely observing her son's downcast mood the rest of that day. She hated seeing her son like that. She knew him too well to sense that something deeply troubled him. A few days passed, and Josh was still in the same dejected mood. In fact, it seemed only to grow worse. The next day, a concerned Melinda decided she would go to Josh's school to further investigate the cause of her son's distress. As Melinda walked down the school hallway, she saw her son exiting his classroom in tears. He fell to the floor by the lockers and wept. "Josh, what's wrong, baby? Why are you crying?" Melinda asked, getting on one knee to hug Josh, but he got up and ran towards the toilet. Melinda ran after him, rushing into the toilet. She knelt outside the only occupied cubicle where Josh's sniffles and cries sounded from the other side of the door. Melinda stormed out of the bathroom and charged down the hallway into Josh's class as if she owned the place. On any other day, Melinda was the petite, young beautiful waitress from the local diner, but today, she was a lioness defending her cub, and the gloves were off. "Mrs. Parker, please may I have a word with you outside," barked Melinda. "Care to explain why my child ran out of your classroom in tears?" Melinda asked with a stern, no-nonsense pose. "I have no idea," Mrs. Parker responded, eyeing Melinda from top to bottom with a little challenge in her mien. "It's probably just kids being kids," Mrs. Parker said. The next morning, convinced the school would be of no assistance, Melinda planted a recording device in Josh's backpack. Over the weekend, she finally listened to the recordings as she lay in bed. Mrs. Parker had the day off that day, so Melinda and the principal decided to visit Mrs. Parker at her house. When they got there, they heard commotion and screaming from inside the house. "This is not fair. You never have any money," Mrs. Parker's teenage daughter screamed from inside the house. The heavy bags in her eyes showed she'd been crying for quite a while. Melinda caught a glimpse of the inside of her house. It was a total mess. Mrs. Parker herself looked quite bad at herself, nothing like she normally did at school. "Don't talk about my mother that way," Josh yelled. "I'm sorry, Josh. But let me teach you something that will help you when you're older. Sometimes the truth hurts." Mrs. Melinda continued to listen to the recordings in awe. Most instances showed Mrs. Parker slut-shaming Melinda in front of the whole class. Melinda could not believe her ears. She was completely furious and horrified at the audacity of Mrs. Parker. On Monday, Melinda stormed into the principal's office to confront him about Mrs. Parker's behavior. The principal listened to the recordings and was shocked by what he heard. Mrs. Parker began to weep bitterly. "I'm so sorry, Melinda. It really wasn't personal. Honestly, I was just jealous. My husband recently left me for a younger woman, and I guess a part of me took it out on you and Josh because you reminded me of everything I lost. Everything he took from me. Even my own children don't want to be with me. And all I've done is love them," Mrs. Parker explained in tears. Melinda felt bad for the woman. It was obvious that Mrs. Parker was taking out her insecurities and frustrations on Melinda and Josh. She had never met any malice before. But what she had gone through had her near to broken. Melinda summed it up as a typical case of hurt people hurting people. "Listen, I hear your story. But the fact of the matter is that you let your personal issues at home affect your work. I'm sorry, but I will have to let you go," the principal said. Melinda saw the broken look in Mrs. Parker's eyes, and she knew it all too well. It was the very same look she saw in the mirror after Josh's dad passed away. All those nights of sleeping herself to sleep. It had taken all the strength she had to build herself again for the sake of her child and herself. "No, principal. Please don't fire her. We've all had tough times. I won't bring it up any further if you can kindly let it slide. I'm certain Mrs. Parker won't let her personal issues affect her work again," Melinda pleaded. Mrs. Parker was completely baffled at Melinda's words. After that day, Melinda also started providing Mrs. Parker with her support and friendship. A part of Mrs. Parker's biggest cause of frustration was her loneliness. Melinda was a single mother herself and believed she could help Mrs. Parker adapt to her new life circumstances. The pair started to go shopping together, and Melinda would share her beauty secrets with her. With her children now making their own money, Melinda was able to help Mrs. Parker get a new wardrobe and a makeover. This boosted Mrs. Parker's confidence and ultimately made her a kinder person, no longer limited by her insecurities. The two eventually became good friends.